Welcome everyone. My name is Antonella Marty, representing the Atlas Society, and here we are with Michael Saylor. Good to see you again. How have you been?
Awesome.
Great. I'm glad and also grateful for the opportunity to interview you. So I'd like to delve a bit into your background and explore how your previous experiences have influenced your success as an entrepreneur. Can you share with me how important studying the history of science, for example, was to your later success as an entrepreneur?
While I was at MIT, one of the degrees I took was in the history of science, and the focus was science, technology, and society. Of course, MIT is known as an engineering school, and my other degree was in aeronautical engineering and spaceship design. So engineering is normally thought of as dry and rigorous. On the other hand, the history of science is all about the invention of new techniques and how they got used within the society where they're introduced. And so politics and economics and sociology all have an impact. And I think in the history of science, it gave me an appreciation for things like network effects. For example, the Romans developed a certain width for a Roman road, and Roman chariots had an impact on that. And eventually, that width found its way into a railroad track. And then if you made cars that were that width, then you could move them on the railroads. But if a nation changed the gauge of the railroad track, then all the trains would be incompatible from the foreign country. And then when you shipped to the border, you'd have to transship or move your cargo from one set of trains and one rolling stock to a different set of trains. And so the decision to create an incompatible technology protocol might have profound economic consequences, might have political consequences, might start a war, or might discourage one. The history of the sciences, it's about lots of sciences. How do we introduce steel in an age of iron, and what happens when iron comes along and replaces bronze? And what happens if you don't master iron, if you don't master steel? I mean, one of the famous books is Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it's all about the impact of guns on the colonization of the New World. And why did the Europeans end up dominating North America and South American civilization? And some of it has to do with immunology and the fact that the Europeans managed to infect each other so much that they had stronger immune systems. And when they showed up in the New World, the germs they brought killed most of the inhabitants without a fight. If you just study political history, oftentimes political history is told from the point of view of people said things and did things. But when you study the history of science, you realize that it didn't really matter what the people said or what they did. When Columbus showed up in the New World, they tried to bring back something like 18 natives on the ship to Spain. Every one of them just died. They didn't know why they died, but they all just dropped dead. So the political interest or the human ambition is thwarted by something they don't understand. In this case, they didn't have natural immunity to the diseases that all the Europeans carried. I mean, the history of science causes you to think about how the civilization developed based not upon ideology, not upon ambition. It's not the story of a politician that came to save us. It's not the story of an ideology that transcended. Perhaps it's the story of this people had iron deposits and that people did not. And so the people with the iron deposits made harder weapons and killed the ones without the iron deposits. Or this people had the Nile River, and the Nile River was hydropower. And if you have a source of hydropower energy, then you have a natural advantage when it comes to agriculture, and then your society is going to dominate. Two interesting takeaways that are relevant to the modern era. One is you come to the conclusion that the civilization or the society that channels energy most effectively generally wins. whether it's channeling energy by replacing a spear with a bow and arrow, or replacing a bow and arrow with a catapult, or replacing a catapult with a cannon, or replacing the cannon with a battleship, and replacing that with an aircraft, and replacing that with a nuclear weapon. Land power, is trumped by sea power, is trumped by air power, is trumped by space power, is trumped by nuclear power. And there's just a relentless progression of these sophisticated societies that learned how to channel energy, and channeling energy at a certain rate and with a certain focus would be power, almost the definition of power, the rate at which you deliver the energy. The second, I think, takeaway from the history of science is that science, the history of science is punctuated by paradigm shifts. There was a time when people thought that the universe revolved around the Earth. The Copernican revolution was this idea that maybe it didn't. The paradigm shifts take place when you develop a new instrument. So it was optics, it was the telescope that caused human beings to realize that the universe did not revolve around the Earth. Once they had the telescope and they could see the moons of Jupiter, they started to realize that you couldn't really explain the movement of certain moons and certain bodies in the solar system based upon the old theory, right? The Ptolemaic theory of the world. And they had to adopt a new theory. Maybe things revolved around something other than the Earth, perhaps the sun. There's a similar breakthrough in medicine, not via the telescope, but via the microscope, where we thought that disease was caused by spirits and demons and all sorts of other random things. And there was a lot of superstition there. But then when we looked at blood and we looked at fluids, we realized there are actually living creatures in those fluids. And we developed the entire medical science of immunology and germ theory. And we started making breakthroughs because we could see. Then there's a pushback. The pushback against the idea that the Earth might revolve around the sun came from the forces of authority, the establishment. Partly it was the church, but partly it was the monarchy and just government in general. The system had been constructed based on a system of authority where you got your truth from a very powerful central organization, and that truth had adopted a certain set of theories, and this challenged the theories and therefore challenged central power. And there was naturally going to be a friction, so much so that you might very well get jailed, deplatformed, or burned, or bankrupted if you push the new paradigm. And Galileo is maybe one of the more famous examples of that. There's a Dr. Harvey in the history of medicine. He put forth the proposition that the heart pumped blood through the arteries and recycled it back through the veins. And of course, for thousands and thousands of years, no one thought that. They didn't actually think the heart pumped blood. They didn't understand circulation at all. And Harvey discovered this, and it was a pretty big breakthrough, but it was so profoundly revolutionary that no one would accept it. The entire medical establishment rejected it. And Harvey's very famous for a quote. He said, "No doctor over the age of 40 will ever believe me." Right? And it leads us to one of the funnier statements in the history of science. Science advances one death at a time, which is maybe articulated by Thomas Kuhn as paradigm shifts take place when the old generation or the old guard dies. You have to wait for an entire generation of power and authority, whether it's in science or whether it's in politics or whether it's in the religious establishment. You have to wait for them to just pass. Or that dogma passes in the event of a war. You're adamantly in favor of fighting wars with horses, and then someone comes along with tanks and machine guns and you realize your horses don't work anymore, then you discard that. I think Billy Mitchell was court-martialed because he suggested that air power would dominate future wars in the 20s or the 30s. And the military establishment didn't like that, so they court-martialed him. And then, of course, by World War II, we found that perhaps air power did matter in wars. And so people change their views towards science when there's a mortality event. If your country is coming to an end or your life is coming to an end, you're going to be open-minded. Otherwise, if it's not a matter of life or death, people typically cling to the old paradigm until they pass. And you just have to wait for a new generation that has a new set of circumstances to embrace new ideas. I think that that's what I took away from the history of science, and that has helped me a lot in my life as an entrepreneur. And when I eventually, discovered Bitcoin, it helped me to understand both why it was so profoundly powerful, but also why it was profoundly difficult for the establishment to understand.
Right. The last time we met, I remember we had a very interesting conversation about astrophysics, delving into concepts like entropy. But let's consider the importance of applying physics to everyday life. Let's, for example, think about the essential role of electromagnetism and the role that it has on like our daily routines. 50% of the world's GDP is based on some of Michael Faraday's theoretical developments and inventions related to electricity. So once again, why we should encourage the study of these subjects such as science, coding, and physics to shape, the future.
If you want to provide prosperity to 8 billion people in the world, if I was speaking to anybody, anyone starting their life or their education, or family said, what should we teach our children in order to make them prosperous? I would say, master the protocols of prosperity. So what are the protocols of prosperity? One of them certainly is math and physics and engineering, right? Those are the science protocols of prosperity. The second would be something like the English language, which is a communication protocol of prosperity. The third would be Bitcoin, an economic protocol of prosperity. Let's come back to the science protocols. Why are they so powerful? Well, because the laws of physics apply without prejudice or bias, everywhere on Earth simultaneously all the time. And so they're not subject to political distortion and ideological distortion. If you know how to start a fire, you know how to start a fire. If your goal is to avoid burning your house down, that's useful. And if your goal is to avoid freezing to death, it's equally useful. And it doesn't matter whether you're a communist, a socialist, a capitalist, a liberal, a conservative, right? Or what race or what religion you are. It's quickly tested, right? For example, in my field, aeronautical engineering, I remember having a picture of an airplane lodged in a tree. And there was a quote underneath, something to the effect of, the laws of our aeronautics are cruel and unforgiving, right? But you don't get to break them. If you build a plane and you don't build it correctly, it crashes and it burns. And there are no irrational aircraft engineers, or at least there aren't irrational ones for very long. You can't get away with something which isn't truthful for very long in the engineering discipline. So I think mastery of physics, mastery of mathematics, they're useful, they're truthful, they're hard, but they're critical to life. If you wish to not starve to death, if you wish to not crash into the ocean, if you wish to not sink your ship, try rowing across the ocean by yourself, and then you'll realize that, an internal combustion engine in the ship would be useful, not running out of fuel, knowing how to calculate how much fuel you need in order to get across the ocean and how much water you need to get across the ocean, and the center of balance, of the ship. All those things would be matters of life or death. Having said all that, they're useful protocols, but they're not the only protocol. For example, base 10 math, it illustrates a point, which is it's a scientific protocol which is useful, but there are others. There's base 2 math. There's Roman numerals. There's base 16 math, hexadecimal math. The Babylonians, divided the day into, these 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of darkness, 360 degrees, and a compass. You have different systems of math. And so why do you want to learn one? You want to learn one because all the machines built in the civilization operate on that one. Take a calculator and it's got 0 through 9 on the keypad. It's a base 10 calculator. If you master the protocol, you can use the calculator, you can use the computer, the programs work, the accounting ledgers work. You not only do you not sound like an idiot, which is it's useful to get the cooperation of other people, but you can actually type a problem into your computer and get an answer that will save your life. So that's why I think we want to teach our children useful scientific protocol. We're gonna need it in order to move, in order to breathe, in order to make the electricity work. And of course, Faraday gave us, in essence, the laws of electromagnetics, and electricity is electromagnetic energy. Not the only form of energy. There's acoustic energy, sound. There's potential energy. There's nuclear energy. There's a lot of forms of energy. John D. Rockefeller gave us, in essence, chemical energy in the form of a barrel of petroleum. But the magic of electromagnetic energy, right, it's clean, it's very efficient. You can put it into your house, put it into your plane, put it into your ship. You can build appliances with it. You can, perhaps wear it on your wrist. You can transmit it through the atmosphere. And of course, everybody, all of modern civilization was profoundly affected by it. People were profoundly fearful of it when that new technology was developed. But every corporation that resisted it became obsolete. And it's just a reminder that when new technology arrives for channeling energy, you have to master it in a responsible fashion. You can't live in fear of it. Even though the word in the English language for an encounter with technology that is painful and unexpected is shocked. So when you touch an electric wire, it shocks you, right? It can electrocute you. It may burn your house down, may start a fire. It's a very scary thing. We're shocked. But in fact, as you pointed out, half of the civilization is based upon overcoming this fear and mastering a new technology for good, as opposed to, cowering in fear of the new and resisting it.
So now that we're talking about that, in the 21st century, one of the most prominent concepts has been digital transformation. The companies that have reshaped the world in the last few decades have pursued dematerialization. How can you describe this concept that you use and why it's so important?
The first generation of technology paradigm shift was, I think, the digital transformation of information. Okay, so what did we do? We took an entire library and we dematerialized it and we put it onto an iPad or we put it into a computer. It used to be a wealthy person had a library of 10,000 books. But then Google scanned all the books and Apple sold you an iPad, and now anyone for a few $100s could have a library of millions of books. So we dematerialized all the books in the world. We dematerialized in the sense that if you had 100 billion books, they all collapsed into bits. We got rid of the material. We got rid of the physical energy and the matter. And therefore, when the essence of the book became information, it became non-conservative. And if I want to manufacture more, I have to chop down a bunch of trees and burn a lot of coal and run a lot of factories, and I have to deliver a lot of paper or a lot of books, and I have to store them, and they're heavy. And anybody that ever carried 100 books up a flight of stairs knows that it's not easy moving books around. I can zap the electrons, and now I can actually give 1 billion people 100 books each. What if I give everybody that ever lived, or everyone that lives, every book ever written? And what does it cost to do that? In the physical world, it's impossible to do practically, and to accomplish 0.1% of what I just described probably sucks up all of the economic energy in the civilization. We've just found a way to give every student in the world every book they're ever going to read for free. This is non-trivial because sometimes people pay $3,000 for college textbooks. So if every student pays $3,000 for college textbooks, and some people can't afford to pay $3,000 to get through college, you can see how the physicality of the book is going to be an impediment for the world to be educated. When we digitally transformed the book, we released huge amounts of economic energy. That's almost like a crystallizing reaction. It's like when the steam becomes water, it gives off energy, and when the water becomes ice, it gives off more energy. And if you want to reverse the transaction, you heat the ice to get water, and you heat the water to get steam. You put energy back in. Well, that energy that falls out of the system, where did it go? It went to Google, went to Apple, right? The biggest companies in the world, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. How did they become worth $1 trillion? Well, they dematerialized the retail storefront, that's Amazon. They dematerialized all books and music. To a certain degree, that was Apple. To a certain degree, that was Google. Facebook dematerialized relationships. Used to be, you took pictures of your family, you put them in a shoebox, right? And you printed a bunch of photos, and you had a bunch of shoeboxes, and you had an album, and you paid for the album, and you put it on a shelf, and you bought the shelf, and you bought the space, and you bought the album, and you bought the chemicals, and you bought the darkroom, and you bought the camera. And all that went away, and what you had was the Facebook album, and the money went to Facebook. So digital transformation of information is profound. If maybe there's 10 to 20 million people in the world with a PhD. There's 8 billion people, but there's only 10 million with a PhD. So why is it that only a small fraction of the world gets max education? Well, part of it is cost, right? You could argue some people don't want to have a PhD, but the cost is extreme. It might cost $1 million to give somebody a PhD. Okay, but if I digitally transform it, it costs the electricity. So that first 30 years, we had explosions in digital information, digital entertainment, digital education, digital merchandising. Microsoft is built on the digital transformation of business processes, and pretty soon every company is shuffling all of their files around on Microsoft rails. If you want to give music to 1 billion people, well, how much did it cost to listen to Beethoven's 7th Symphony, in 1850? Well, you have to be a king. You have to have 100 professional musicians, right? The kings actually had their own royal orchestras. And they hired and retained 100 musicians to be always ready to play for royalty. And I guess you can calculate what it costs. In the Western world, a full orchestra is millions of dollars a year, and you divide it by listening 20 times, and you conclude that it's extremely expensive. On the other hand, I could deliver you Beethoven's 7th Symphony on a phonograph record for the price of the record player and the phonograph. And then when we finally dematerialized the phonograph, the record player, and the record itself, and we dropped them into a file that runs on an iPhone or an Android phone, now you could give Beethoven's 7th Symphony to everyone for the cost of the electrons, and that's probably not even a penny. So you want to give music or culture to everybody on Earth, you got to do it digitally. That's what created the internet wave. That was very characteristic in the mobile wave. But there's a fundamental distinction between information and energy. And so I would say the first generation, the first 30 years was the digital transformation of information, and information is non-conservative. I can give you my copy of Moby Dick as a book, and I'm transferring something embedded in energy, and if I give you the book, I don't have the book. But if I send you the PDF file of Moby Dick, I still have the file and you have the file. We both have the book. So I can give all 8 billion people the book in a non-conservative way if it's information. But if there's energy in it, energy content, I have to transfer the thing from me to you. So the first 30 years of this revolution were all about digital transformation of information. And only recently we moved into the next stage, which is the digital transformation of energy. And the conservation of energy is one of the most basic laws of physics. And conservation of energy means that potential energy becomes kinetic energy, but then the potential energy is gone. When I'm up here and I dive to here, I'm no longer there. And if I could dive to here and also be there, the universe wouldn't work, right? So I think Bitcoin represents the most profound application of the creation of digital energy and the channeling of digital energy. And it's a paradigm shift because everyone that has engaged in the digital revolution and the digital transformation of anything else, all of their learning was about the transformation of information and not energy. And so they have a hard time grasping the fundamental difference between a conservative and a non-conservative interaction.
And now that we mentioned Bitcoin, I want to know, what did you think when you heard about Bitcoin for the first time?
What I thought about Bitcoin when I heard about it the first time is probably what somebody in 1905 thought when they heard that someone in their neighborhood was playing with electricity. And then somebody's house burned down and someone got shocked and they got electrocuted. I thought, it's kind of dangerous, but they're probably not going to let people keep doing that, or I don't know what'll happen. And then I switched back to whatever I was focused on. It was, so when I heard about Bitcoin, it must have been 2011, 2012. It was very new. And it was one of 100 things. I was fascinated by the mobile revolution. I was interested in iPhones. I was interested in smartwatches. I was interested in everything Facebook was doing, everything Microsoft was doing, everything Google was doing, everything Amazon was doing. And also there was the Bitcoin thing happening. And they were all just flickering. But, in my personal investments, I didn't invest in Bitcoin. I invested in Apple and Amazon and Facebook and Google. And in my business life, I didn't really think I needed Bitcoin. It wasn't an institutional grade asset. I wouldn't have thought about that. And our business was about selling enterprise software in order to manage information, which was analytics. And that was it. I didn't really think about it again for about 8 more years or 7 more years. And the second time I thought about it was during a war. And so I said, why do people embrace new paradigms? Huh? Right? You need a near-death experience, a mortality experience. When I give you a diagnosis and I tell you, you're going to die of this disease, you all of a sudden go back to the internet, you start researching the disease, and if you find that there's some kind of experimental therapy, you read up about it, and maybe you get on a plane, you fly somewhere to do something about it because you have more to gain than to lose, and you're quite motivated. So in March of 2020, the pandemic struck. The world locked down. The world kind of turned upside down. All the offices were emptied. People started working from home. The monetary system went haywire. Interest rates went negative in large parts of the world. There were $18 trillion of negative yielding debt floating around. Like, how does money be negative yielding? And the interest rates in the US were lowered to 0. And so I thought the cost of capital went to 0. I think that's like making time stop or making, negative yielding money is like making water flow uphill. And I thought, okay, well, I'm in a world where time is flowing backwards, water is flowing uphill. You ever see those movies of all the people on the beach just before the tsunami hits, and there's a tidal wave coming, and it's all just fine, and the sun is shining, and everybody's having a good time, and then the water starts to recede, and it goes out half a mile. Then the entire world's about to turn upside down. You're about to get struck by a 50-foot or 100-foot wall of water, and you have to run for your life. And if you look at that and you say, there's something really profoundly wrong, but I can't keep on going business as usual. I really need to take urgent action. That's what I felt in March of 2020. And I think I wasn't the only person that felt it. A lot of people felt quite concerned, distraught. Our first thought was, what do we do about, our people, our employees and our customers, and then how do we run the business? And then after that, we realized that we were sitting on $600 million of cash that was yielding zero. The central banking system was pursuing a policy that was very inflationary. We were going to pump a lot of currency, a lot of dollars into the system, and it wouldn't be noticed immediately, but we were going to have inflation, if not hyperinflation. If we take Argentina, for example, the peso was 20 pesos to the dollar in 2018 or so. I remember it because we used to obsess over it. It must have been 40 or 50 to the dollar by 2020, and of course today it's 1,050 on the blue dollar rate. So I could see that there was going to be currency collapses all around the world, and I could even see the U.S. dollar collapsing or weakening. In my opinion, actually, I think if you look at a surrogate for the strength of the dollar, it'd be the S&P 500 index, and it is 50% up, which means the dollar lost like 35-40% of its value since that time, measured in a portfolio of desirable assets. So I looked at that and I thought, well, our cash is a melting ice cube. It's worth $500 million right now, but it's not going to be worth $500 million in 4 years. And our business is under stress. We're locked in our homes. And people are working via Zoom. It's hard to grow the business P&L, and it's hard to see the employees. So on one hand, my human capital, my people are going to be raided by the big tech companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft. And it used to be that people like to come to the office and they like to work together, and they're not going to just quit and move across the country for a new job. But in June of 2020, it was clear people were going to be working from home for a while, and you don't have to move across the country. You could just point your web browser or point your Zoom at a different TCP/IP address and get a new job. So we started thinking, this is not good. We may lose all of our employees. And then we looked at all of our cash, and on one hand, our cash was earning 0% interest, but the S&P index rallied and stocks were hitting an all-time high, and it was pretty clear that financial assets were going up, and the cost of capital is like 12%. If the cost of capital is 12%, if I have to generate a 12% return on my capital, I'm generating a 0% return for the next 4 years. There's going to be a shareholder revolt. So we were worried about losing our employees, and we were worried about losing our shareholders, and we had this big pile of cash which was worthless. And then the central bankers said, we're not even thinking about raising interest rates. And some central bankers said, well, we think we should make interest rates negative. So our primary asset was a liability. Our human asset was maybe going to drift away from us. And our shareholders were unhappy. And the stock, hit $90 a share. It was maybe 100 to 120 when we were thinking this through. And we were, in the midst of the war on COVID, and what I think was a currency war, a war on capital. When someone says, I'm going to charge you 1% for all your money in the bank, that's pretty close to a war on capital, right? In that situation, we had to choose between a fast death, a slow death, or taking a risk, right? That is the essence of the paradigm shift. What's the fast death? The fast death is give the capital back to the shareholders. If we simply bought the stock back, we would have a company not growing with the employees working from home with no shareholders. And the stock was trading $2 million a day and no volatility. And so if there's no volatility and there's no liquidity, the stock options are worthless. But the stock options are how you compensate your employees. They're going to get hired away by the trillion-dollar companies that have infinite money and have stocks and companies that are growing and stocks that are stock options that are valuable. So giving the capital back would just make us die fast. We'd have to sell the company. The slow death is keep the capital, but the stock options are worthless. The human capital bleeds off. The shareholder base bleeds off. We get lost, right? And we can't crawl out of that. There's just no catalyst to get out. How do you work harder? I mean, we were working as hard as we could together, and then pretty soon we were all stuck in our kitchens trying to work through a little Zoom link, and that was not better or easier. The issue is, what do I do with $500 million? What do I invest it in that's going to yield more than the cost of capital? You know, it's the summer of 2020. You need to find something to buy that's going to appreciate in price or in value more than 12% a year after tax, or in a tax-deferred, tax-efficient fashion. It was not bonds. You couldn't buy any individual set of companies because companies are securities, and there are prohibitions on a publicly traded operating company holding more than 40% of its liquid assets in securities. So we couldn't just buy all securities. So then you got to buy commodities, but every commodity is generally inflationary. Buying silver or soybeans or petroleum or natural gas or timber, those aren't good stores of value because people keep making more commodities. The king of commodities is gold, but gold supply increases 2% a year. And so gold itself is not outperforming the S&P index. You can't, so that wouldn't work either. So then we started thinking, can we buy real estate? But how do you buy a liquid portfolio of $500 million worth of real estate? And the problem was, real estate's valued based upon interest rates. So if interest rates go to zero, real estate values triple. And so the real estate values by the summer of 2020 were extremely high because the interest rate was extremely low. So then you start thinking, what's left? Art? How do I find a diversified portfolio of high quality art that's fairly valued? Not easy. We crossed all those things off the list and we thought, well, what if we could fix the defects of gold? What about digital gold? And that led us to crypto. And the idea of digital gold is, what if I actually could create 21 million gold coins, dematerialize them, move them at the speed of light, and then make it impossible for anybody to make any more of the gold coins? And what if I could move them on a computer? And I thought, well, that sounds like magic gold. But if God came down from heaven and said, look, I'm going to run the monetary system. I'm going to create 21 million holy coins. I'm going to store them in heaven. I'm going to let you decompose them infinitely. I'm going to let you telepathically move them between any two counterparties and make sure nobody cheats each other. And I promise to do the work for next to nothing forever. You would probably think that's okay. That's probably an upgrade to every existing deal you're going to get. But in the absence of a deity offering to do that for you, then the next best thing is, what if we actually created that system with cryptography and the internet and some semiconductor technology? And that, in essence, is what Satoshi did. Satoshi created a crypto network, which is like perfect pharmaceutical grade gold. Satoshi called it a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But what that meant was, I'm going to create 21 million crypto coins, make them subdividable by 100 million Satoshis, so 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis. I'm going to enforce the protocol with semiconductor technology called SHA-256 hashing. I'm going to let you do that hashing using a semiconductor chip. And then I'm going to distribute that Bitcoin system on a node and give it to anybody on Earth and make it open and free. And so that system became a form of crypto gold. We were looking around for something to replace our dollars with. What is our treasury asset? And by process of elimination, everything else was overpriced or defective, or not acceptable from a regulatory point of view because they're securities and not commodities. So we found the one thing that might work, and you have to go through this analysis. Well, there's 10,000 copies. What's the winner? Well, Bitcoin was the winner of the 10,000 copies. Was it banned? No, it looked like it wasn't going to be banned because the IRS had designated it as property in 2014. And then the last part is that it had been hacked. And Satoshi has 1 million coins. It was worth $10 billion at the time we were looking. Today it's worth $60 billion. And no one can they can't hack it to get those 1 million coins in that wallet. And I figured if no one's figured out how to steal $10 billion hiding in plain sight, then it must be pretty hard to hack. And once we determined all that, we embarked on our Bitcoin journey.
So I want to take you back to the concept of entrepreneur. When one says the word entrepreneur or even wealth, it always seems to carry a negative connotation. So the entrepreneur is completely demonized. How do we break away from that perception? Like, when you talk about entrepreneurs, what do you mean? What does it mean to be an entrepreneur for you?
Well, I suppose entrepreneur, has different meanings in different cultures. We're lucky in the American culture, entrepreneur normally has very positive connotation, but in certain more authoritarian cultures or more conservative cultures or traditional cultures, maybe it's a negative connotation. An entrepreneur is an economic engineer. That's how I would interpret them. It's an engineer is attempting to use their mastery of scientific protocols, mathematics, physics, all sorts of engineering disciplines, metallurgy, chemistry, aeronautics, to create some product or some service, right? Whether it's clean water, whether it's an X-ray machine, whether it's an airplane, whether it's Henry Ford's car, automobile, right? The engineers are creating something, and they're doing that in humble submission to the laws of nature. Water won't go uphill, right? not without some serious engineering. Ships that are unstable capsize and sink. Unsuccessful entrepreneurs create products that don't work, right? So the first element is you have to successfully engineer a product or a service. And in that regard, it's admirable. I mean, that's why we like Henry Ford. That's why we like John D. Rockefeller, because John D. Rockefeller came up with Standard Oil, a barrel of oil, and we take it for granted, but the oil didn't explode in your face and burn your house down. That's why it's Standard Oil meant that it wasn't likely to explode in the lamp, and it wasn't likely to be a health risk. And that mattered at a time when people would die if it wasn't, right? If you go to the Hershey's factory, the Kraft factories, they were the early clean engineering experts to actually create ketchup or create food, put it in a bottle, and then keep the bacteria out and be able to store it on a shelf for a month or a year or even a week. That was a quite amazing technical achievement because if you didn't do it right, you would open the bottle of whatever and it would make you sick. It might kill you with food poisoning. And so the original branded food, it was important because if I saw the brand, it meant that the food probably wasn't rotting. or, the food was safe to eat. And we take it for granted today because all food's safe to eat. We're really good at it now. But there was a time when people weren't good at it. And the reason that we bought all of our food from Kellogg or from Kraft or from Hershey's was because they were really good at manufacturing clean food in clean rooms. And it's non-trivial to figure out how to do that. The first half of the entrepreneur is engineer the product or service so it's safe, it's effective, it flies, it doesn't make you sick, right? It doesn't blow up in your face. The second element of being successful entrepreneur is the economic engineering part. How do you manufacture the product for less than it's worth? Right? How do you provide the service that is better than the competing service? How do you provide the best service? And that means struggling with the issue of how much labor do you employ and what, is it better to produce the food with expensive, inputs or with cheap inputs? And what does the market think and what do the customers think? So I think entrepreneur sometimes just means anyone who's an economic adventurer, right? So I start with 1 million of them. The successful economic adventurer, that means the winner. And the winner had a good product, but also produced a good product at the right price in the right way. And the thing that's admirable about them is they have to master not just engineering, but economics, practical economics, not theoretical, ideological economics. They teach you things in school that just aren't true, right? And they'll be like, well, in school, just tell the people that work for you to do blank. And then you go in the real world and tell the people that work for you to do blank. And they get up and walk out and quit. And then the factory shuts down, right? And then your best customer quits you. And then you go back, and then the bank calls your loan and you get bankrupted and the company fails because you did something that you read in a book somewhere. And the truth is, doing things with real people in the real world calls for a much greater degree of sophistication and subtlety, and acumen than doing things in the theoretical world where you treat, people like robots. People aren't machines. And your employees aren't machines. Your customers aren't machines. The mayor of the city where your factory isn't a machine. The governor isn't a machine. The country isn't a machine. Everybody's got opinions, and you have to work in the world of politics and sociology and economics. You have to compete with someone else who's just as smart as you, maybe smarter than you, more motivated than you, that wants to take away your market from you. You have to deal with that. You have to keep your shareholders happy, and the shareholders are considering your returns versus everything else they can invest in. And then you have to deal with the laws of physics. And if that gets out of balance, your plane falls out of the sky, or your bridge collapses, or your building collapses, or your company collapses, or your capital structure collapses, or your stock collapses. If there was no John D. Rockefeller, we wouldn't have had oil, and if we didn't, and oil itself probably stretched people's life expectancies 10 or 20 years. Try rowing across the Atlantic, right? Or next time you need to go somewhere, use wind power, right? Mm-hmm. And then figure out what your life would be like with wind power and horsepower to get from here to there. And Rockefeller doesn't sound like a robber baron so much as he sounds like the person that gave us the gift of chemical energy. And, you have General Electric and Edison that gave us, practical electrical energy, and Westinghouse, and then you had Mellon who gave us aluminum, and aluminum is pretty important. You can't make an airplane without aluminum. Everything falls out of the sky made out of steel. If you don't make it out of aluminum, it won't fly. There is no modern air travel without it. And of course, Ford gave us the automobile, and if you don't think it's important, read the history of everyone that ever died because they were walking from point A to point B, or they're trying to ride a horse from point A to point B, right? And so all of these entrepreneurs, they were very profound in the way they revolutionized the civilization and they all mastered engineering and economics in a very difficult, chaotic political world and competitive economic world in order to bring us to where we are today.
And again, many people take those achievements for granted. But let's move to philosophical ideas. But first, can you talk about the role of science fiction and fantasy novels in shaping your thoughts about yourself and the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people in my generation, they were shaped by science fiction and fantasy. I mean, the science fiction is important because it was very creative writers considering the implications of technical advances they could imagine, but we had not yet realized. For example, Heinlein, who's one of my influencers and a big influence of a lot of people in my generation. He wrote "Have Space Who Will Travel" and "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress" and "Time Enough for Love" and a bunch of other things. And he talks about artificial intelligence back in the 60s and the 70s, what happens, if it takes over, and talks about the implications of genetic engineering or the implications of space travel. And I think it stretches your mind. It forces you to imagine how would you use this technology if you had it. And of course, so many technologies that came along afterwards, the computer, the internet, the mobile phone, and all the applications and networks, right there. They were driven and they were inspired by those science fiction writers. I think if you think about William Gibson and some of the early cypherpunk and cyberspace writers, I mean, Gibson posited cyberspace and between Neuromancer and many of his short stories, Burning Chrome and the like, he started getting you thinking about what happens in a networked world where money moves at the speed of light and where security or the loss of security, even for a split second, can destroy your company. Like in one of his books, I think Burning Chrome, one of the actors loses security for a split second and they lose everything, completely impoverished, and it's completely permanent and irreversible. And so those science fiction works, they evoke terrifying possibilities, electrifying possibilities, inspiring possibilities, and they motivate you to want to study science and then want to apply and build products and build services. So, in some cases it inspires, Bezos and Musk to build rockets to go to space, but it also inspires us to go to cyberspace and to think about the consequences of that and how it's empowering and how it distorts social norms and political norms, right? And to a certain extent, it even predicts what happened. I mean, I think Heinlein referred to the 2020s as the crazy years in one of his books. Is very interesting and what they predict. Well, now fantasy is a little bit different. The difference between science fiction and fantasy is science fiction, they try to imagine you in space, and when you're there, what happens when you throw the baseball, right? And the answer is the baseball, maybe depending upon the trajectory, it re-enters the atmosphere and burns up, or it gets in an orbit and it circles the Earth in a stable orbit forever. Or maybe you launch it in an escape velocity and it escapes Earth orbit but circles around the sun, or maybe it escapes solar orbit. So there are all these possibilities, and you think about them, and maybe they're inspirational. But fantasy is different. In some ways, it's inferior. In some ways, it's superior. But fantasy is what happens in a world where the laws of physics don't apply. So what if I just throw the baseball and it morphs into a dragon and it, flies down to Earth and it breathes fire, on a lump of coal, which is transmuted into a pot of gold, and then it whacks the pot of gold with its tail, and a leprechaun jumps out and they wave their wand and you're in an Emerald City. Okay, that can happen in fantasy. It can't happen in science fiction. Fantasy introduces other ideas like, a lot of in magic, it's all about, do you know the spell? Mm-hmm. There's also a theme that pops up over and over again. If I know your name, I can control you. If I know the name of a demon, I can control the demon, so I don't want you to know my name. Well, this idea of casting a spell and protecting your true identity pops up a lot in cyberspace, where the spell, by the way, Satoshi's spell would be the private keys to the million Bitcoin. And if you knew Satoshi's spell, you would be one of the richest people in the world. Maybe you'll be the richest person in the world in 10 years if you know the spell. And the spell is just some words. If I take all my money and I put it in a Bitcoin wallet and I can remember 12 words, I know the spell to unlock all the money. Okay, so spells matter, and we don't know who Satoshi was, right? There's this reverence for the pseudonymous in the world of the digital, and you can start to create things that look more magical than physical in cyberspace. Now, cyberspace is just this very interesting mix. The stuff that's magical is the flow of information at the speed of light. But the physical is, I can't grant them all Satoshi's coins. I can only grant one person or one thing, or if I split it, I split it, right? So there are some things that look physical because they're energetic and conservative in their physicality, and there are other things that look virtual. And the study of fantasy is the study of the virtual, because things are non-conservative. You have a conjurer that basically, you ever see the movies where a person that's 200 pounds and they're able to transmute themselves into 200-pound wolf? That looks more like science fiction. You can imagine that with nanobots. But when the 200-pound person makes themselves into a 20,000-pound dragon, that's non-conservative. Like, where'd the extra mass come from, right? Mm-hmm. And so the magic is about being able to do anything you can imagine, and the science part is about only being able to do things that conform with the laws of thermodynamics, and the laws of motion, and either relativistic physics or something. I think you want to study both. Sometimes the engineers are just too orthodox in their thinking, right? They're too constrained. It's like, well, I can imagine these three things, and everything has to be one of these three things, and that's all I can imagine. You end up with the problem of skeuomorphism. When people created mobile apps, the first thing they would do is they would take a product in the real world, the keyboard, and I put the keyboard onto the phone. But then you realize that, it's got no mass, but it's not that much better than a physical keyboard, and maybe it's worse than a physical keyboard. In the fantasy world, wizards don't type on keyboards when they want to give an order. They just talk to the mirror, or they talk to the genie, and they say, "Genie, blast the castle," or "Genie, fly me to the top of the mountain." Okay, so if you study fantasy, you're like, I'm going to take the physical keyboard and I'm going to talk to it. Well, where's the keyboard? Well, we don't use the keyboard anymore, because why would you? That was an accommodation, right? You got to think different, right? And if I think different, I'm not going to just reproduce the best physical version of the way the world used to do things. I'm going to actually reimagine it. And that takes you to, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Well, what is Zoom? People said, well, we got to shut down the office. I don't want to shut down the office. We have to shut down the office. Okay, we're shutting down the office. Now what are we going to do? Well, we tried the first technology. It doesn't work out well. We discard it. We tried the second technology. It doesn't work that well. We discard it. We tried the third technology, Zoom. It sort of worked okay. I was like, oh, okay. And then the next morning, an email goes out from the CEO. We have adopted Zoom as the enterprise standard. Everyone will master it. You have 1 week to go through the training course. Get ready. That was the paradigm shift. Technology fails until it succeeds. That's just something I learned in the history of science. And the second thing, and this is emblazoned on the back of our prospectus, that prospectus up there, on the back of it is a quote by Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I believe that enough to put that on the cover of our IPO prospectus in 1998. And that's something I learned from my science fiction reading. But you notice how we managed to put technology and magic into the same sentence. You wonder if you were to go back to Roman times and you showed them the modern Zoom, they would think that's a magic mirror, right? And of course, we're one step from artificial intelligence and AI bots. And it's kind of almost a ghost, but I worry about the version 3 versions ahead of this one, where you'll definitely have intelligences. You'll have artificial intelligences which will not exist in space. They'll exist in cyberspace, in the ether. And now I go to my magic mirror, my Zoom, and instead of Zooming to talk to my brother or my employee or my investor, I'll just talk to Galacticus, or Economist. An economist is just an artificial intelligent agent that's read everything the human race has ever written and everything about economics and has scanned every piece of news up until 100 milliseconds ago. And then you're going to say economist, I really like Hayek or maybe you'll bring Ayn Rand back to life, right? And tell me what I should think about blank, or what is your opinion of blank? And now we're back to Snow White and the Wicked Witch. And okay, am I talking to a demon? Or am I talking to a demigod? Or am I talking to the ghost in the machine? I saw pictures of Winston Churchill online and videos, and I thought, given everything he wrote and everything we know, I wonder if someone won't actually bring the ghost of Winston Churchill back to life in cyberspace, load it with everything Winston ever said, then then you can interpret his principles and his values, right? Just like we know the values of Aristotle, we know the values of Rand, we know the values of Hayek, or the values of many different philosophers. That's why we study them, because they had values. You just put those together, then you plug in a large learning model, then you plug in all the modern information, and you say, Winston, what do you think the Prime Minister of the UK should do today? And Winston will start talking to you. Now, does it sound like I'm meandering, or is it possible that I have been inspired by a combination of the readings of fantasy, the readings in science fiction, the observation that advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and the thought that, maybe I can... What do you do in magic? You bring things back from the dead. There are a lot of fantasies, fantasy books where people have the power to talk to the dead. Right? That's a fantasy idea. But, at some point, you start to bend time and space. Right? There's a fantasy in the Game of Thrones. Bran Stark can actually move through time and space and go back and see anything, and he can actually tilt it. Well, when you pull up YouTube and enough video and you say, well, I want to know what it was like to live in Florence in the 14th century, it'll actually sift through everything and find someone that created an instructional video or simulation on Florence in the 14th century. And it's pretty interesting how everything that's ever been uttered by the human race and everything ever recorded and is uploaded is starting to be there. And the question is, what's the difference between Bran Stark and you, if you can talk to YouTube?
And now that we're talking about authors and politicians, you also mentioned Game of Thrones, and I'm trying to connect some characters in movies to political theory, I would say. Do you like Star Wars?
The rebels fighting against the overpowering crush of the authoritarian empire. And yeah, that theme, I think, resonates. That's always resonates with youth. Mm-hmm. When you're youthful and you're in school or you're at the beginning of your life and you're rising up through the world, and what you see is authorities, whether it's your parents, the community, the school, the industry, right? You're struggling. And so that resonates. It resonates with those that believe in freedom. Mm-hmm. Right? If I had my religious freedom or my economic freedom deprived of me by an authoritarian guild, a regulated economy, an overbearing nation state or whatever community, then it resonates there. It's like you're the rebel. It resonates with the entrepreneurs. The most famous Apple commercial, 1984, and it's like, the PC, the individual will have their own computer, and you don't have to be slave to the IBM mainframe owned by big authoritarian corporation, megacorp. And so I think that's a very powerful theme. I think it's constructive and empowering and inspirational.
Yeah, I mentioned Star Wars because I remember when Palpatine declares the emergence of this first galactic empire, and Padme says, so this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. Do you think that's a description of populism at some point?
It's a reasonably good one. Mm-hmm. Generally, authoritarians never think they're authoritarian. They think that they're imposing a new rule of law to save the people from themselves or from some other greater enemy. So it's like, the word barbarian, right? It's just people that speak a different language than us. Mm-hmm. It's like the others. They have a different language, and it's helpful if they have a different God, because if they have a different God, then our God told us to kill them. It pops up 10,000 times throughout history. It's always the charismatic leader that raises the army and rallies the people to thunderous applause, right? There's almost no example, where a nation starts a war where everybody's not applauding. It's very easy to rally people, to a particular cause by either pointing toward another enemy or by forecasting the doom of the society. We need this law because otherwise, we will boil the oceans, or we need this law or else we'll all die of this disease, or we need this law or else the barbarians will kill us all, or we need this law or else we'll have chaos and disorder. And there's always a justification. It just turns out that you end up with 100,000 of those things, and no one of them ever sounds that bad, but they all seem like good ideas. But it's like it's death by 1,000 cuts, or death by virtue signaling, and eventually you've straitjacketed the entire society. I'm reminded, even Frederick the Great was admired by Voltaire, and Voltaire was this great iconic, progressive thinker right, of the 18th century, foreshadowing the French Revolution. And Durant, in his Story of Civilization, he has an entire book dedicated to the age of Voltaire. And Voltaire was full of a lot of wisdom, and one person that Voltaire idolized or admired was Frederick the Great for a while, because he was supposed to be the philosopher king. He was a genius and erudite and a polymath and good at everything and admired philosophers. And then there's a point where Frederick the Great just randomly declared war on a neighboring country, and his justification was, well, they're not attacking us now, but if we don't declare war on them, they eventually will attack us. So we have to attack them first. And that was one of the the points when you realize that maybe nobody's perfect, but the number of examples where the good guys declare war proactively because they know they're going to be attacked, that's a lot. And then the rest is then they end up fighting the war, for another reason, and that just goes on. But there's always a populist reason to do it, and there are always unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Ayn Rand, and all of Ayn Rand's fiction and philosophy celebrates human achievement. You have called Bitcoin the apex achievement of the human race, and think of it as a living creature. In what way, and how's that?
The human race is the story of civilization is about harnessing, channeling energy. So it's technical advances that allow us to channel energy, and the first most famous figure is Prometheus, right? Prometheus is the Promethean, right, is its own word, but the mythical figure that actually gave us fire. And, fire is chemical energy, and fire was pretty instrumental in humans rising to rule the world, and there are a lot of good arguments to say it affected our biology. It shortened our digestive tract. It increased the size of our brain. What can you do with fire, right? So many different things. You can defend yourself against animals. You can pre-digest, cook your food. You can heat yourself and avoid freezing to death. You can melt ice. You can clear a forest, right? It's a pretty good idea. And you can't, if we didn't have fire, right? You try to imagine where would humanity be right now, and it's not clear we would be outdoing the apes. Maybe they would do better than us, if we didn't have that one trick. And now the issue is, what is the significance of Bitcoin, and what is the significance of Satoshi? Well, Satoshi is the Prometheus of digital energy. Look, I'm sure, I don't even know if Prometheus ever lived, right? We don't know. It's a mythical character, and maybe there were 10 different human beings that saw fire, but once we figured it out, we kept it, and that's stretched out over millions of years. So it really is, kind of mythical in nature. Well, Satoshi is kind of mythical character as well, but what did Satoshi do? Satoshi figured out how to manifest something of value in cyberspace forever and transfer it without the intermediary. So what does that really mean? If you can put $1 of value in cyberspace, you can put $1 billion of value into cyberspace. And if you put $1 billion, you can put $1 trillion. And in the last 15 years, we put 1.3 trillion. Well, there's $900 trillion of traditional wealth in the world. We have opened a portal. Satoshi opened a portal, a technique, and we started seeing economic energy moving from the analog world and the traditional world, the physical world, the analog world, into the digital world, to a pure digital representation. And that's like putting payloads in orbit, right? I put a satellite in orbit and it circles the Earth forever. I put a satellite almost in orbit. How long can you fly? 15 hours, and then your plane crashes. So almost in orbit is 15 hours, and in orbit is 15 billion years, as far as we know, right? So there's a pretty big difference between putting something in outer space versus putting it in space. And there's a big difference between putting something in cyberspace versus leaving it in real space. J.P. Morgan said he said gold is money, everything else is credit. What he meant was, if I hand a bar of gold to you that's worth $1 million, you have $1 million of gold. But if I hand you a check that has $1 million written on it, you have an IOU. And if you go to the bank to cash the check, there may not be any money in the bank. You may not get your $1 million. But if you have the gold, you have the gold. The gold is the bearer instrument. It is the object. The check is monetary information. The gold is monetary energy. One of them is conservative. I gave you the gold bar. I don't have the gold bar. The check I wrote to you for $1 million, and you walked out of the room, so I wrote him $1 million check. And then I wrote him $1 million check. And then I wrote another $1 million check. And now I'm a banker. I wrote $10 million of checks. I only have $1 million. I asked for 5% interest in each one. I maybe make myself $500,000 a year in interest off of money that doesn't exist. And I maintain, that's called fractional reserve banking. And I maintain, that illusion as long as I can. And when the illusion finally comes crashing to earth, right, all of my creditors are bankrupted, right, and the economy collapses. So Satoshi finds a way to put money in cyberspace. Bitcoin is money. Everything else is credit. Everything you ever process is a digital payment on a computer. When you use Apple Pay or Google Pay, or when you used your bank account, you weren't moving money, you were moving credit. And the problem with credit is an IOU. An IOU to who? It's actually an IOU to a stack of counterparties. Basically, for you to cash that check, you need to get the local bank, the correspondent bank, the central bank of the country you're in, the central bank of the other country, the correspondent bank in the other country, and the issuing bank, and they all have to concur. And then the person that actually transferred, they have to not decay or reject the transaction. So sometimes there's 7 intermediaries that might actually represent a credit risk, or might actually be a credit default to you. And any one of them can default on their obligation. Now, how long does it take for that to settle? Might take 45 days. So when I tell you I sent you money over the internet, I told you I make a representation, it's an IOU, you won't know whether you have the money for 45 days. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, what if you slammed into a brick wall, but you didn't know you hit the brick wall until 45 days after the collision? What happens to creatures that have no pain receptors? Right? You get squeezed out of the gene pool, generally, because there's no feedback. So the problem with the world today is cyberspace is corrupted by its non-conservativeness. We have too much information. The information is toxic. All of the signals in cyberspace are toxic signals because there is no cost to do anything. What Satoshi gave us was a money, but the money is energy, and the energy is matter, and the matter creates substance, and the substance creates friction. And friction isn't a bad thing. Friction is air resistance, but friction is how you walk across the floor here. If I take the friction away from the floor, you'll fall and hurt yourself. You need the friction. Now, what's a practical example of this? Well, most of the signals, a lot of the signals in cyberspace right now are toxic or misleading, criminal, not even real. On YouTube, every 15 minutes, there's a fake Saylor Bitcoin giveaway video spun up, and it looks like me, and I'm talking, and I'm telling you that you have just a few minutes to send me one of your Bitcoin and I'll send you 2 back. And I give you a little barcode. Okay? Every 10 minutes we scan for that and we then report it and we get one taken back, but then they keep putting them up. And they put up thousands and thousands of them every month, sometimes tens of thousands. So you've got continual attacks in cyberspace from what we'll call demons, right? If I'm an evil genius, I can come up with all sorts of bot attacks that attack your website, attack your product, attack your service, and you end up with, catfishing, you end up with, with intelligence attacks. It's, one of the interesting things I've observed, using social media is oftentimes I post something and the most toxic responses were actually not even people. You would have 97 bots that would post inflammatory responses or attacks in order to get me angry or to get my followers angry. And I would watch real people arguing in cyberspace with bots. And I'm thinking they spun that up in a few milliseconds and they have 10 million of them operating and you're a real person and you're arguing with the machine. How's that going to end? Right? And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but you can imagine if you wanted to actually bring the society to its knees, you would have leftist bots that are attacking those on the right, rightist bots attacking those on the left, people of one race attacking people of the other race, and you would just sow racial division, class division, ethnic division. You would go and act like a male insulting females, act like a female insulting males, make them all hate each other and just crank up the gain, right? And just step out of the way and let them all kill each other. You could have a situation where 99.99% of the population loves each other. And I just introduce a machine, right? And the machine goes and just sows dissent. So how do you avoid that, right? And that takes us back to Satoshi. If you want to build something of beauty in cyberspace, you have to introduce matter and energy. You have to introduce truth and consequence. You have to introduce the idea of time. And we never had a way to do that before. And Bitcoin is the first chance, is the way for us to create something that's real. I can create an actual material wall. I can create a wall that says, you want to go through this wall, you have to post $10. I can create a wall that says, you want to go through this, it'll take you this much time. I can put a time barrier. I can put a capital barrier. I can say, you want to come into my home, you have to place a deposit of X, $20 worth of money. But I only want to be in your home for 187 milliseconds. Okay, post it, come in, and leave 188 milliseconds later, and I give it back to you. Okay, now, how do you do that with a credit card? You can't, because most of the world doesn't have a credit card. But if you did, the credit card doesn't settle for 30 days. How do I actually have a 187 millisecond transaction on something with a frequency of once every month? It's like, and if the transaction fee is 2%, well, that means when I do 50 transactions in 16 seconds, I've lost all my money, right? So Tesla, who is truly a great figure, he said, if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Vibration is the transformation of one form of energy to another form of energy. When I pluck a guitar, when I pull it to here, it's potential energy. And when I let go, it's kinetic energy. And it's either in a state of high potential energy or high kinetic energy, just like this pendulum, right? Potential, kinetic, potential. This is the vibration. And the vibration is the rate at which that energy is transforming itself through phases. We're hearing it, right? And when you hear it, it's music. And when you hear the vibration in harmony, it's beautiful music. And the human being is gifted with the ability to sense this music, right? Frequency. We hear the frequency. Let me tell you how powerful it is. I have a parrot. That's 18 months old. The other day, someone started playing Bob Marley reggae music, and the parrot started dancing and got happy. Okay? How is it possible that a parrot evolved over millions of years all of a sudden decides he likes Bob Marley music? It didn't go to music school. You think that energy, frequency, and vibration don't change things? When parrots actually react to music, and the 6-month-old parrots also react to music, what that's telling you is that it is genetically coded in our DNA, and the DNA is resonating and vibrating with the frequency of the universe over the course of millions and millions of years. And so now the question is, how are you going to put energy into cyberspace, right? How are you going to vibrate it at a certain frequency? And our world before Satoshi is built on no energy. It's built on credit. It's built on shadows, on ghosts, on disembodied spirits. It's not built on real things, real matter, real energy. The things in cyberspace are dead. They're dead, shadowy representations of something that was real, is real. There's a real thing in the real world, but the thing in cyberspace is a dead thing. It's a reflection of the real thing. Satoshi let life into cyberspace. And energy is life. Life feeds off of energy. And if you want to create things of beauty, right, then you have to be able to release the energy, and then the energy has to start to evolve. What's the frequency of that digital credit? 30 days. Let me say it differently. 10 times a year. Okay, we're not talking 10 hertz. 10 hertz is 10 times a second, right? There's not even a word for how slow that is. We think once every 6 weeks we can vibrate. Well, you ever listen to Beethoven's 7th Symphony or play a trumpet or a guitar or a piano, right? A440, right? The rate at which the economy runs on 20th century rails with analog assets and credit. To say it's 1,000 times slower is an understatement. It might be 1,000,000 times slower. Like, I give you $1 billion of gold. How long does it take to move it 10,000 miles? You could probably move it once a year at great expense. I give you $1 billion of Bitcoin. I might move it 1,000,000 times an hour once I've mastered the technology. So, how do you advance the civilization? You channel energy. What's it mean to channel energy? Frequency and vibration. How do we know it's good? The phrase in English is, it's music to our ears. That's how we know it's good, right? And it's literal, but that's just acoustic energy. Someone's good singer is good at channeling acoustic energy. And Satoshi gave us digital energy. It's a paradigm shift. The world doesn't understand it. They didn't know that. They didn't expect to find it. It's something we didn't expect to find, just like we didn't expect electricity.
So this brings us to the final question of the interview. How can Bitcoin help citizens in Latin American countries where we have very high inflation rates?
I think If you understand Bitcoin as digital capital, a capital asset, or think of it as the element of money which is store of value, the long-term store of value element, then it provides you with a capital asset to build your life on. If you're an individual, then it represents a savings account in cyberspace run by incorruptible software for someone that doesn't have the wherewithal to run their own hedge fund, right? It's simple, it's secure. If you just need a savings account where you work your entire life, you put money there and the money goes up in value, and you don't have to worry about the bank seizing it, the government debasing it, some company failing you. What does everybody want? They just want to not lose their money. But more importantly, if you have a certain amount of money and it buys less every single year, then you work your entire life, and when you retire, the money you've got is worthless. If it's in a Western bank, it's still there. It's just not buying anything. But if you live in an African nation, the money would be worthless maybe within a few years. So Bitcoin represents that global incorruptible savings account for individuals. There's the biblical phrase, build your house on rock and not sinking sand. You wouldn't build a house on a swamp. You wouldn't build your house on shifting sand. You wouldn't build it on a sinkhole. When you build a building, you want to put it on granite. And if you want the building to last for 100 years, you have to put it on granite outside of the floodplain. So if you think about a company and you have money in the company, if you take your cash flows and you convert them into US dollars, they're losing 7% of their value a year. Okay, so you have $10 million, you're losing $700,000 a year in capital value. When we started this interview, you asked me how did I get interested in Bitcoin. Well, what I realized is the company, MicroStrategy, had 2,000 people making about $75 million a year in cash flow. And the $500 million in the treasury was going to lose $75 million a year in value just sitting there. So what we realized is the treasury asset was losing all of the money that everybody created through the work for the year. So that's a classic example of running as hard as you can to stand still. The idea you're negating 2,000 man years of work because your treasury strategy is defective. So what Bitcoin represents is a non-defective treasury asset to the world, right? If the cost of capital is 12% a year in dollars and you store your money in T-bills, your after-tax yield is 3%. So that means that the conventional strategy for every corporation and government and institution would be to invest at 3% but lose 12%, and therefore you're minus 9%. You're losing 9% of your capital every year. So if someone came along and said, I'm going to actually give you a capital asset that's going up 12% a year, that would be the same as building the house on granite and it doesn't sink. Okay, so at least you're not doing any damage via your savings, but you're not creating any value either via your savings. You're simply not destroying any. If you had an asset going up 24% a year, and Bitcoin's been going up much more than that, like it's going up 40, 50% a year for the past 4 years, but if it goes up faster than the cost of capital, you're actually putting your corporation on a rising platform. That's what rich people do, right? If you're a very successful business person, you would say, I worked for 10 years and I invested it and I bought a bunch of apartment buildings and now the rent on the apartment buildings pay and I don't have to work anymore and I retire early. Well, the reason you're doing that is because you're using appreciating property as your capital asset. You just have to have you have to be very lucky and you have to be very talented to use property as capital asset. Because if you invest in the wrong buildings in the wrong neighborhood in the wrong country, maybe that doesn't work. Bitcoin represents this very straightforward global capital asset where a person working can save their life's work in a capital asset, and eventually they can retire and not work anymore. And that becomes the endowment for their family, maybe forever. Some organizations that understand this, if you look at universities, they have endowments. They don't invest their endowment in cash or bonds. They invest the endowment in property, sometimes in equity. And that's why Harvard University or Yale, that's why they can go on forever. But operating companies, they don't have an endowment. They normally just use bonds, and bonds are credit, they're crumbling, and their capital structure is crumbling. It's like you built a building in a swamp. You don't see buildings stand for 1,000 years built on a swamp. You have to actually have a firm foundation. An example of that is my company. So my company had that $600 million of cash that was generating 0% interest, and our stock was dead money. Nobody wanted to buy it, and then we were like worth $120 a share. We actually converted to a Bitcoin standard, and we started buying Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin kept going up in price. And in 44 months, our company went from a $600 million enterprise value to a $25 billion enterprise value. And we ended up with somewhere in the range of $14 billion of Bitcoin. And so if Bitcoin just goes up 10% a year, we would generate $1.4 billion a year of investment gains. The company was only generating $70 million a year in profit. So we generate 20 years of profit, an entire generation of profit, even in a bad year with Bitcoin. Or another way to say it is, we have 100 years, worth of money. In essence, the entire company is now endowed with a bulletproof balance sheet. And before, what we had was a melting ice cube. It's kind of simple. You choose something going up 24% a year versus something going up 3% a year, and you compound that over the course of multiple years. And what you realize is that, at 24% a year, you double your wealth every 3 years. And you double your wealth 33 times in 100 years, right? And if you're only compounding at 3% a year, but the money is collapsing at the rate of 7 or 10% a year, then you'll never catch up. You'll just be impoverished. So I think Bitcoin, it represents a way out of that economic malaise. You can do it with $20 a week. You could do it with $20,000 a week. You could do it with $20 million a week. And everybody has the same rights. And you can do it in Nigeria, or you could do it in Argentina, or you could do it on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. There's no difference in access. No one gets special privileges. It's fair. It's equitable. You're buying a piece of property that every intelligent person in the world wants to make more valuable. So if you bought 10 acres in Alabama, there's nobody in Argentina trying to make the land in Alabama more valuable. And traders in Singapore aren't going to do anything with a computer to make the land in Alabama more valuable. But if you buy a Bitcoin in Alabama, then the more chaotic it is in Argentina, the more people want to buy Bitcoin in Argentina, making your Bitcoin more valuable. And then the smarter the trader in Singapore is, the more Bitcoin he or she needs, making your Bitcoin more valuable. So you're plugged into the global digital economy, and your Bitcoin is going to go up as technology advances. It's going to go up as people come up with new ideas. It's also going to go up as more capital gets created. It's also going to go up with more chaos. And that's the second fascinating thing here. Satoshi created Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has embedded in it a chaos engine. The more chaos in the world, the more valuable the Bitcoin is. And every single time an economy collapses, it creates a stampede toward Bitcoin. Every time someone prints too much money, it drives up the value of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's at an all-time high in Argentina. It's an all-time high in Turkey, right? If the Turkish government collapses, Bitcoin will be even more valuable. So Bitcoin is this fascinating way to harness entropy, right? And to be powered by chaos. There's a certain peace of mind that comes from saying, I have plugged into a network that is fed by chaos and also fed by order simultaneously, because the genius in Singapore will find a way to make billions of dollars with Bitcoin and make the Bitcoin price go up. And then the batshit crazy dictator in Africa will destroy their economy and make the price of Bitcoin go up. And I'm just going to hold and let the rest of the world unfold as it will.
So we started the conversation talking about entropy, and we end the conversation talking about entropy. I love this connection between Bitcoin and physics. So I really enjoyed the conversation, Michael. Thank you for your support and for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. You can stay connected with all of the Atlas Society's content by hitting that subscribe button below.